right, college football from last week had a lot of blowouts, a lot of not very good games, but we did have two very important games. Well, I can't say two very important games. There was a couple of important games that definitely had impact throughout the day or throughout the 2 days of college football, but there's only really 2 to 3 really actually good games that I can really recall from this weekend. And the main one was Alabama versus Auburn, which was a really good game. You know, I kind of thought it might have some magic to it. I didn't really do a preview video last week, Thanksgiving week. I was kind of busy. But I definitely was feeling like Alabama was going to win the game. I felt like Alabama was going to come out on top. I thought it'd be close, but I thought they'd eke it out. And then they'd go into that SEC championship game next week, and they'd handle it against Georgia, and then we'd be in the playoff. And I was thinking Alabama would kind of end this SEC two-team thing this last week, but that didn't happen. Auburn came out better than Alabama, and when you think about Alabama, you might sit here and you might feel like you can now say, well, Alabama's really not that good. They're just protected because they've been so good for so long. This team doesn't really pass the eye test every week, and you can say that. But when has Alabama ever really just slaughtered teams? They kind of come into every game with a target on their back. They don't really come into any games with a target on another team's back. So I think this is definitely a wake-up call, but it's one of those things, a wake-up call at the worst time of the year. Clemson got a wake-up call in the middle of the year, and I said at the time, this is really not that bad of a loss for them. They can definitely recover. They lost early enough in the year, but this is the loss that's just too late for Alabama. And like I said, Stidham played really well. He looked really good. He threw for a lot of yards. The running game was going to have to get going at some point, but they did a great job of doing a lot of passing in the first half, and they stayed with them in the first half. And then Alabama did score that touchdown to start the second half, and it looked like it might have been a situation where they were going to get going, and I thought it was going to be one that was going to be pretty close throughout, but Auburn was able to pull away pretty late. Let's talk about Miami and Pittsburgh. Miami just didn't show up on that Friday. Pitt, they knocked off Clemson last year. They knocked off Miami this year. They really hadn't had that good of a season the last couple of years, but they did knock off, a top 3 team, and they've done that in the past a couple times too. So a good win for Pitt there. It's not that I'm not really surprised that Miami lost. I've kind of not liked Miami all year. I'm actually kind of glad they lost, because if not, we'd probably be looking at 2 ACC teams making it in, because they'd have a reason to be like, Miami's number 1, but they lost to number 2. Well, now they're going to be number 4 or something like that. So it's good that it's honestly good that they lost. It gives Alabama a little bit of a better chance to get in if some other teams lose. But I don't know. I wasn't surprised that Miami barely beat Virginia. I've said all year that they kind of just played to about who they're playing against. And so, I don't think that they're not going to give Clemson a good game next week. I think they definitely will give Clemson a good game. They're going to make Clemson earn that spot. And I think, they definitely were thinking about that game more than they were thinking about last week's game against Pitt. But we'll see what happens. We'll talk about that in a minute, though. Let's talk about a couple other games from last week. USF, UCF, real good game here. Mackenzie Milton was able to lead UCF one last time over Quentin Flowers for USF. Real good game. This game decided a lot. This was a game that decided who won this game. Got to play Memphis in the American Championship. And UCF's looking at an undefeated season now with a win next week. They've already beat Memphis 40-13, but I definitely think this game is going to be closer this time around. Notre Dame, Stanford. Notre Dame kind of gets their playoff chances ruined with the loss to Stanford. Stanford made a couple turnovers to start the fourth quarter and really just jumped on the gas and jumped on the throat of Notre Dame. Washington State. Luke Falk had another one of his fog games where he just didn't show up. That's something that's kind of coming more and more. It's either Luke Falk is very hot or he's very cold, and then Browning, he's just excellent in the red zone, doesn't turn the ball over, like probably about 50 touchdowns now, 0 interceptions or turnovers in the red zone. takes care of the ball very well. I think I thought he might come out, but there's a lot of quarterbacks coming out, so I think he'll come back next year. And I think Washington's year might be next year with Jake Browning at the helm in his senior year. Ohio State, Michigan, talk about this one for a minute. JT Barrett kind of got hurt before the game. Tanya Harding incident 2.0. Supposedly the cameraman and purposely hurt JT Barrett or something like that. But anyways, I'm not going to get into all that. Ohio State won the game. They're going to be playing Wisconsin next week, and Barrett is projected to start the game. We'll see how that one goes. Clemson, South Carolina, just to touch on this one, South Carolina jumped all over, Clemson jumped all over South Carolina. Wasn't even close. Good win there for them. So that's last week's games. Let's talk about the playoff outlook now. So to me, if we're looking at the playoff next week, I think Clemson definitely has to be the number one team. They've definitely been they haven't lost in a while. And they're winning all their games, passing with flying colors. Auburn, I have to go with number 2 on their list, knocking off Alabama, who was number 1. And they beat Georgia a couple weeks ago, who was number 1. They're 2 losses on the year, one to LSU, which they probably should have won. They lost late. And Clemson, they lost in the second game of the year, which, Auburn definitely doesn't look like the same team that they did in the second game of the year. But you can say the same for Clemson. Clemson doesn't look the same as they did at the first of the year. Oklahoma, I'm going to put Oklahoma at 3. They hadn't lost in a while. They can continue to win. Their one loss really isn't that bad when you think about how Iowa State actually turned out. At the first year we thought that was a bad loss. It really isn't that bad of a loss. Wisconsin finally gets in at 4. They hadn't gotten really any respect all year. They don't really deserve any respect all year. They hadn't really beat anybody every game that they have had. That was tough, has been at home in Madison, and they usually play very well in Madison. So, to me, they're going to be at 4 now because they're undefeated, but they're going to definitely have to handle against Ohio State next week to get in. Alabama, I got Alabama at 5. Alabama to me is just the most talented team. Regardless of the loss last week, I feel like any slip-ups that happen this week from any of these teams, Alabama gets in. Georgia's definitely on the outside looking in. They have to beat Auburn, but a win over Auburn, I think, gets them in the playoff, being the SEC champion. And they would definitely jump Bama in my eyes. Just because Bama's at 5 right now doesn't mean that I would say that Georgia wouldn't jump them with a win. Being able to play in the championship week gives you the ability to jump teams that are actually in front of you because you're playing a game, and you can potentially beat a team that's in it. And I would, if Georgia can beat Auburn this week, I definitely put Georgia in. And you talk about Miami. Miami is definitely on the outside looking in. I got them at 7 now with the loss to Pitt, even though they're just a one-loss team. I'm not high on them. The eye test, I don't like how they look. And I definitely think they're going to lose to Clemson this week, so I can leave them there and not feel that bad. And then Ohio State, Ohio State's a team that you got to leave right here. We got to talk about because they do have a slim chance. If enough teams lose, they can potentially maybe get that 4th spot. If enough teams lose, maybe USC can get that 4th spot. So those are really the 9 teams that have a chance to make it. Ohio State and USC, let's talk about them for a minute. They really have no shot. The only way that they really get in is if the committee says, Alabama, since you didn't win a conference championship, we left you out and you get jumped by Ohio State and USC. But for that to happen, Wisconsin would have to lose to Ohio State, so that would put Ohio State in that position. Georgia would have to lose, so that would knock Georgia out. Miami would for sure have to lose. So Georgia, Miami, and Wisconsin all have to lose for Ohio State or USC to have a chance. USC also has to beat Stanford. So potentially I see Miami losing, I see Georgia losing, and I see Wisconsin losing. And if those 3 teams lose, I put Alabama in at the 4th spot. And they would play Clemson in the first game, and then Auburn would play Oklahoma in the 2-3 matchup. That's how I would have the playoff. Now, let's talk about the games next week. Miami, Clemson. I think Clemson definitely wins this game. Auburn, Georgia. This is going to be a really big toss-up. Kerryon Johnson not playing. If he doesn't play because of the shoulder injury, I think it definitely gives Georgia the edge. I think it's going to give Georgia a little bit of confidence. I think Georgia's biggest issue was if they had to play Alabama, the beast of Alabama. They've played Auburn once before. I think this is a winnable game for Georgia. I really like Auburn. I'm a kind of a little bit of an Auburn homer in a sense. I've always liked Gus Malzahn. I really love that offense. So I want to pick Auburn in this game, but my gut's telling me Georgia could win this game. And if Georgia wins this game, I think they jump Bama and they get in, and that would knock Auburn out for me. Georgia would take their spot. Let's talk Ohio State, Wisconsin. I really think Ohio State's going to win this game. JT Barrett's health is a big key to it. If he doesn't play well, it's going to be hard for them to win. But I think this is a game for Wisconsin to lose. I think this is definitely one for them to lose. But I will say a couple years back, Wisconsin did kind of get blown out of the water by Ohio State. And it kind of bolstered Ohio State into the playoffs. So I would not be surprised if Ohio State, kind of gets slaughtered this game and Wisconsin blows them out of the water to, for sure make sure a Big Ten team gets into the tournament or to the playoff. TCU, OU, I think OU definitely demolishes them. It's going to be a little bit harder that it's on a neutral site. TCU is definitely going to want to ruin a season. I see that in their eyes, but I don't think that they do it. I think OU wins, and I think OU makes the playoff. USC, Stanford. I'm going to take USC. I think Bryce Love runs crazy on them, but I think USC wins the game, and I don't really think that game has much meaning to it. It'll be on Friday. Maybe we get some viewers. Fresno State, Boise. Fresno State won last week, 28-17. I really think Fresno State can win again. This one will be a neutral site. I think the last one was at Fresno, but we'll see what happens with this one. I'll take Fresno, though. I've really been impressed with Fresno State this year. Probably the biggest surprise team of the year. Memphis and UCF. This will be a real good game in the American Conference. The winner will play in a January 1st, a New Year's Day bowl. And I'm gonna go UCF. I think they get the undefeated season. It's gonna be a real good game, though. I think it's definitely gonna be closer than the one they had early in the year. So let's talk about some kind of like postseason type of awards in a sense. So let's talk about the Heisman first. Obviously, I think Baker Mayfield's probably the favorite to win it. He's on the best team. I feel like the Heisman always has a little bit to do with who is who is on the best team or which team's done the best. So I think Baker Mayfield is definitely the best candidate to win the award this year. Yeah, he's had some antics lately, but I'm not going to let off-field antics or in-game off-field antics define the on-field player. I don't think Oklahoma would be anywhere close to where it's at if they didn't have Baker Mayfield. Bryce Love definitely second, just because Bryce Love is definitely second, just because he's had an awesome year. His yards per carry average, and then but his record just isn't as good. Lamar Jackson, I had to put him on the list. He's had just as good of a season as he did last year. His team's just not as good as it was. I think they're 8-4 or so not terrible, but not as good as the Baker Mayfield's team. So I don't really see Lamar Jackson winning this year. Shaquan Barkley, he ran out of gas towards the end of the year. And Penn State really didn't have that many meaningful games towards the end of the year after they lost the Ohio State one, so he couldn't really make a really impact or a Heisman run there. He's not playing in a Big Ten championship game. And then if we're talking about maybe a fifth dude, I would either put Kerryon Johnson or I'd put Rashad Penny. Rashad Penny, San Diego State, didn't really get a lot of airplay, but he's a really good player, a really dominant player. Kerryon Johnson. For me, Kerryon, the way he played against Alabama, the way he's just played throughout the year, he's a little bit injured at the first year. He's kind of been injured throughout it, and I think he's a really good player. I really like what I've seen out of him, so he's another guy that I like. So some other awards that we'll talk about that I kind of have just throughout the year have been noticing the great play of these different positions or these different units for these different teams. Let's talk about O-line. Obviously, I think Wisconsin definitely has the best offensive line. I'd say Alabama has a pretty good offensive line too. Don't forget about Auburn. Auburn's got a good one. Georgia, Clemson also is another team that's got a pretty good offensive line. Those are some offensive lines that I like. Defense, obviously I like Wisconsin. Wisconsin's probably got the most dominant defense. Really like how they played throughout the year. Alabama, Clemson is another team that has a good defense. Auburn, I mean, all these teams at the top, they have good, offensive lines and defensive lines. Washington has a really good defense. They just kind of replaced the players that they lost from last year. And then Miami is another team. Miami, I don't like Miami, but I will say Miami does have a really good defense that I do like. Let's talk about some fullbacks. Let's give some fullbacks some love. Marks from Stanford, he's the guy that leads the love. Bryce Love, he's a really good back. Baldwin, this kid is the fullback for San Diego State. He's a really good fullback, leading Rashard Penny. And then Dimitri Flowers for OU. He's a huge part of that offense. And then you can't forget about Winston Dimmel. Dimmel's the fullback for Kansas State. He didn't have a huge year stat-wise, but he's a guy that you look at, and he's just a great player. I really like Winston Dimmel. Hopefully, he gets a look he gets looked at by NFL prospects. And then last guy Chandler Cox out of Auburn. He's just a good little blocker. Tight ends, Mike Gesicki had a really good year. Catches a lot of jump balls. Mark Andrews, little security blanket for Baker Mayfield. Troy Fumagalli dealt with some injuries this year. He's kind of doesn't really have a quarterback at Wisconsin. He's a good blocking tight end. I really like him. Hayden Hurst is a real good player for South Carolina. I want to give him a little love. And then Dallas Goedert, a little FCS love. He's a really good tight end. I think he's probably the top tight end, him or Gesicki, coming out of the draft this year. I really like Dallas Goedert. He kind of reminds me of Travis Kelce a bit, so I really like him. So let's go to special teams. Kansas State definitely has the best special teams. With Snyder as the head coach, always good special teams. Alabama, that's kind of underrated, but they always have a good special teams. Their special teams always pretty much does well. And then Auburn, Auburn's kicker, Daniel Carlson, is phenomenal. I really like him. Utah has one of the best punters and kickers in Gay. And then Memphis maybe doesn't have as strong as a kicking unit, but their returning unit is awesome with Pollard. And I gave them a little bit of love there. And so let's talk about some of the skill positions, the best positions, or the most fun positions to talk about. Running backs. Let's go with running back combos. So the best running back combos, I'm going to go Georgia with Sonny Michel and Nick Chubb. That's my favorite combo there. Some other combos that I like, the two guys at LSU, Darrell Williams and Darius Geis. Those guys had a really good year. Minnesota's got a little bit of a three-headed monster with McCray, Shannon Brooks, and Rodney Smith. Kind of a three-headed monster, not a combo there, but I really like that. Those three guys had a real good year running the ball. Washington with Lavon Coleman and Myles Gaskin is another group that I like. And then NC State, I think his name's Niles Hines and Jalen Samuel. Those two guys at NC State had a really good year. I liked what I saw out of them. Let's talk about just the one running back guys, the one-headed monsters that had really good years. Like we always talk about, Shaquan Barkley, Bryce Love, Rashad Penny. Those three guys had really good years. So those are my top three guys. But some guys that I want to give some love that I know you've heard of, but give them the love. Philip Lindsay from Colorado had a really good year on a pretty bad team. Was really good. Jonathan Taylor, obviously Wisconsin's running back. Darryl Dawkins, the running back for Colorado State, he had a phenomenal year. Royce Freeman, his team. Oregon had somewhat of a tough year, but he had a really good year. Ronald Jones, kind of under the radar, he kind of gets overshadowed by Sam Darnold, but Ronald Jones had a really good year. Justice Hill for Oklahoma State, I really liked him. Benny Snell for Kentucky, pretty underrated. Josh Adams, he kind of seemed injured towards the end of the year, but he's a guy that was good when he was healthy. And then Kerryon Johnson, another guy that I like at the running back. And then let's talk about, this is probably my favorite one, the wide receiving cores. A lot of good wide receiving cores in college football this year. Probably my favorite, though, is SMU with Trey Quinn, Cortland Sutton, James Prochet. Those three guys, that's just a perfect unit between them three. Ole Miss has got a pretty good unit too. A.J. Brown, DK Metcalf, DeMarcus Lodge. There's another guy, I think Van. They got 4 guys that have over 30 receptions on the year. Really good Ole Miss unit, and a lot of young guys too on the unit that'll be back next year. Colorado, Bryce Bobo, Shea Fields, and Devin Ross. These guys were definitely probably better last year as a unit, but they still all had over 40 catches. I really like all 3 of them. We'll see how they go going forward. And then let's say Syracuse had the best like combo of 2 guys when you talk about Stephen Ishmael and Phillips. Those 2 guys are phenomenal. It's mainly them 2 that catch the balls though for them. Oklahoma State's got 4 guys that's really good. Marcel Aitman, James Washington, Jalen McCleskey, and then Stoner, little white boy who definitely came on later in the year. Missouri, they had some pretty good wide receivers too. A kid named Emmanuel Hall. I think Jonathan Johnson, younger guy. I think he was a sophomore. He had a good amount of touchdowns, and their best guy was Jamon Moore, who had like 60 receptions, a good amount of touchdowns. And then West Virginia, can't forget about them. David Seals had a really good year, had a ton of touchdowns. Karan White, Kevin White's brother, and then Gary Jennings catches tons of balls. He had a really good year. Those are a lot of the wide receivers that I like. I want to give them some love. And then let's talk about QBs. Definitely you got to go Baker Mayfield as the best QB. Mason Rudolph as another guy that I like. Lamar Jackson, Jake Browning, and then you got to go Drew Lock. Drew Lock's definitely my surprise guy. He threw for tons of touchdowns, not a lot of interceptions. Well, he did throw a good amount of interceptions, but he threw way more touchdowns than anybody else. Broke the single season record for quarterbacks. I think he definitely needs to come out of the draft. Another one more guy I want to add, Will Greer. Will Greer had a really good year. And then future quarterbacks that we can talk about going forward. Obviously, Jake Brown will be back next year, so he's the guy for next year. I want to see what happens with Sam Darnett. I don't really think Sam Darnett has to come out if he doesn't want to. I feel like he's only a sophomore or so I think he could stay another year. I could see Darnett staying another year with the tough year he had. But some other guys that I like next year. Ben Hicks, SMU's quarterback, had a really good year, playing with a lot of confidence. Mackenzie Milton. He reminds me of basically Marcus Mariota and Baker Mayfield fused together. That's basically what he is to me. Justin Herbert got injured this year, broke his collarbone, but I really like him. I think he's poised for a big year next year. Bentley from South Carolina, he played really good. And then my FCS love of the day is going to be Case Cookus, Northern Arizona quarterback. I really like him. Tough game, though, for him. He got knocked out of the FCS playoffs last week. But he's a redshirt sophomore. He's hopefully coming back next year. Threw for a ton of yards this year in FCS. Let's talk about some coaching, the coaching carousel. Now, we know that Florida's head coaching jobs open. We know Nebraska's head coaching jobs open. We know Tennessee's head coaching jobs open, and we know that UCLA has hired Chip Kelly. So some guys that have definitely been fired. Obviously, Florida, McElwain, Riley for Nebraska, Mora for UCLA, Sumlin for Texas A&M, Butch Jones for Tennessee. Todd Graham's been fired from Arizona State. And then Brett Bimmel has been fired from Arkansas. I think Cliff Kingsbury's job saved. I think he'll come back next year. Jimbo Fisher is a guy that I think he should come back next year. He could be on the hot seat with a really bad season, but if I was them, I'd bring him back. Jimbo Fisher's a guy that will be coaching somewhere else if he does get fired, though. Some guys that's kind of coming up, after a hot season. Definitely Gus Malzahn, Matt Campbell. Mike Leach is another guy that is kind of getting looked at. Greg Schiano is getting looked at. Lane Kiffin getting looked at after the year. He had Dan Mullins getting looked at by Florida. I think Florida will probably add Dan Mullins. If I was going to bet on somebody, I think they'd add Dan Mullins. I think Nebraska adds Scott Frost, the guy at UCF right now. I think Muschamp could leave. Muschamp could go somewhere else. He had a pretty good year. Can't think of his name, but NC State's head coach or Wake Forest head coach, they definitely, both those guys could be going somewhere. I always want to show love to Brett Venables, defensive coordinator for Clemson. I think he ought to get an opportunity to go coach somewhere. Jeff Tedford is another guy. He's at Fresno State. He really turned that program around once again. He's a guy that I would like to see get to coach somewhere else. So, and those other guys that I mentioned that got fired, they're definitely guys that could definitely be going and coaching somewhere else. Todd Graham's a guy that I like. I think Brett Bimelow will get a job somewhere. I think Butch Jones needs to chill out. I think he doesn't need a job for a while. I think Jim Mora needs to get the hell out. Kevin Sumlin, he'll probably go to some small Texas school and make them better or so. Riley will probably he probably make another school better. And McElwain, he could probably make another school better. So that's how that goes, and we'll see what Ole Miss does with their with their situation at head coach if they bring Matt Luke back. But some, definitely some teams that could be losing coaches here in the SEC. Arkansas, Auburn, Mississippi State, Ole Miss. Definitely those teams could be losing coaches. Florida, and they could be replacing them. Definitely some carousel and going on in college football right now.
I get so high, I touch the sky till I can't even function. I get so high, I fuck around and wanna leave the function. The only thing that's on my mind is I'm gonna leave with something, but it's nothing. We roll with the Tussins, and we gon' get